second. Yes, there it is. Thank you. Looking at the wrong screen. All right, John chapter 1. So last time we began, we gave some kind of introductory notes to the book of John, talked about some recurring themes in the book. And I think that we're going to see a lot of those themes this morning in John chapter 1. We're only going to go verses 1 through 18 this morning. And I realize we're kind of, with the schedule that we have, we really need to keep moving. But in order to grasp the rest of the book, I really think that we need to dive into John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 to give us a big sense of what John is going to be trying to do through the rest of the book. So it'll be beneficial for us to slow down for just a moment and go through this and then pick up with the narrative portions after we finish this. So again, we're only going to be in chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 this morning. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to let you know, I'm just going to start talking. If you have comments, please feel free to jump in at any point. But I'm just going to get going, and we're just going to power on through. Okay, so John chapter 1, beginning verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and all things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. I'm going to stop right there for just a moment, okay? John begins his account, as the other gospel writers do, with John does not begin, as the other gospel writers do, with the historical Jesus. Instead, John opts to go with the prehistoric Jesus. That does not mean caveman Jesus. It means before the world began, right? Okay, so John does this by introducing the reader to what he calls the Word, or in the Greek, the Logos. Okay, so this title for Jesus is only used by John. So we got to figure John's using it for a reason. What's the purpose? What can we know about Jesus and then about the Father by the use of this word? Now, John will not directly associate the name Jesus with this figure, the Word, until the end of this prologue. But that partly really seems to be the point, right? The eternal Jesus led up to the historic Jesus. We did not have a man on earth named Yeshua who was the Messiah until this point in history. But that individual, that personage, existed long before. And John the Baptist is going to say that, right? So this person is not named yet. And John is leading up to the introduction of Jesus. The reader's understanding to this point, then, is going to set the stage for the rest of the narrative to follow. Now, we got to be clear about this, and we're going to hammer this through the whole prologue. John is leaving no doubt of his position that Jesus is God, okay? If you ever had to deliver a master's thesis, I never went for a master's, but I hear all about it, right? That you got to know your material. You got to know what you're putting forth, because when it's put to the test, you've got to be able to defend that. So if you've ever had to defend a master's thesis, you know that first you have to write your findings and then defend them. 1 through 18 is John's thesis statement. It's the statement that the whole book is based on concerning Jesus' divinity, and the rest of the book is going to be the defense of that position. So the thoughts in the prologue all stem then from John's first declaration. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, to accomplish the purpose of defending that position, that Jesus is God, John's going to go way back to the beginning. And he's going to talk about this individual called the Logos. Okay? We need to see how the use of that title would have struck the earliest readers of the gospel, the earliest Christians of variety of backgrounds. Remember, John is one of the last book, presumably one of the last books written in the New Testament, at least one of the later books written in the New Testament. And so it's being written to a variety of people. This is not like Matthew's gospel, where it's written predominantly to a Jewish audience. It's not like some of the others that have a very specific audience in mind. John is writing to everyone. And so how would a society that, granted, at this point, at the point that John's writing is Roman, but how would a society that has evolved from Greek culture have understood this word? So in the late 6th century BC, a philosopher named Heraclitus believed that humanity had a faulty view of the universe because they only took the world at face value. What I see is what I get. Okay, if there's a tree, it's just a tree. It is what it is. However, Heraclitus put forth the idea of the why of things. What he said is, the learning of many things teaches not understanding. To truly know a thing, I need to understand the nature of that thing, is what he's saying. He believed that one needed to train their senses, not only to experience nature through sight, smell, sound, the senses, but also to consider why those things are the way they are and why nature behaves the way it does. Now, today, we have a much greater sense of biology, right? We understand that one thing affects another, which affects another, which affects another. And that is the reason that our world works the way that it does. And one shift in that balance of biology can affect a whole host of other things. So Heraclitus is not going down that far down that road, but he wants to consider why things are the way they are and why nature behaves in the way that it does. So much in the same way that if I'm listening to someone speak a foreign language, right? I can memorize all the Spanish words I want to. If I don't have any idea what those words mean or why the person speaking them is using them and putting them together in the context, then I'm not going to get any meaning. I'm not going to get anything. So there's a difference between just kind of knowing a thing at face value and knowing the why of that thing. And so to answer the question of why, Heraclitus proposed the idea of the logos, or the word, which is a universal understanding of things that link them together and give them purpose. And again, the word logos is where we get the word or the suffix ology, biology, sociology, psychology. It's a study of a thing or knowledge of a thing. Okay, 300 years later, that concept is still around, but it's taken up by the Stoics, who developed the idea of the seminal logos, which is the driving force or the will behind the creation and the growth of the universe. Marcus Aurelius said, "Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are the cooperating causes of all things that exist." Again, it's a unifying theme in the universe. And so we're taking the why of the universe a step further, and he's saying it's surrounding something. Each thing is not its own individual thing living together. They are all linked together under one unifying theme. So around the 1st century then, so coming up on the time of Christ then, the concept of the logos was taken up by a philosopher, and I'm sure he's not the only one, but those like him, named Philo. Philo was a Jew, but he was a Hellenistic Jew. He's a Greek Jew, a Greek-speaking Jew in that culture. from Alexandria, Egypt, Library of Alexandria, right? And so he takes the concept a step further and he personifies that unifying theme as a distinct entity. So now we're making this unifying force a person. And so he says this entity acts on his own behalf separately from God, but as a mediator between man and God. And so God is the brain, the logos is the movement of those things, and then we are the result or the beneficiaries of it. So the logos then is separate from God, but acts on his behalf to sustain the universe. However, in Philo's view, and I know we're very academic here, but bear with me. In Philo's view, this entity never had a bodily form on earth. So in Greek philosophy, there's a very sharp divide between spirit and flesh. And so this is where we get concepts like Gnosticism, right? Where these things cannot coalesce. They can't exist together. And so that really poses a problem. I think you're kind of getting the sense then that's an issue when John comes onto the scene. So although the Logos is personified, much like wisdom is personified in the Proverbs, there's no earthly incarnation of the Logos. There's no one person who comes down and then speaks the will of the Father or even claims to be the Father. Okay, so now let's get past philosophy then. Let's look at John's use of the Logos. First, lest we think that his concept of the Logos is derivative of these other folks, remember that the Word of God as an agent of creation and sustaining that creation has been stated in Scripture long, thousands of years before Heraclitus ever came onto the scene, before Greek philosophy was a thing. And I'm sure each culture tried to wrestle with that, but we know from the beginning, and in that where John starts, in the beginning, we read, in the beginning, what's the next word? God. In the beginning, God. And there you go. So there's that unifying force. Now, when God creates the universe, how does he speak it into existence? Or let's say specifically man. How does he speak that into existence? Let us make mankind in our image. Okay, so there's something distinct there, something somewhat separated from God that God is speaking to. All right, so we're getting closer now, getting closer. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. God covered the surface of the watery depths. This is Genesis 1:1-3. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, and God said, let there be light. So God spoke. So here we've already got a link between God and Word, because God used words to manifest his will. And that manifestation of will was creation. It was the thing that he was doing. Psalm 33:6, the heavens were made by the word of the Lord, and all the stars by the breath of his mouth. So now let's come back to John 1:1-5. Here we have 7 assertions regarding the Logos, the word. Let's look at these for a second. Let's see if we can kind of determine the significance of each one of these to the overall point. The rest of 1-18 is going to move much faster than this, but let's kind of step and look into this for just a second. Okay, in the beginning was the Word. Obviously, we've already just said the opening 3 words are familiar to us if we read the creation account in Genesis 1, as we mentioned. John is making a clear connection to God, since the only thing that existed before creation was God himself. This is the God of Genesis. This is not some new God. This is not some new understanding of God. This is not some evolved idea of God. This is the God of Genesis. It is a link directly back. And like God, it's something that already was and continues to be. So it's not something that began itself and then began something else by speaking it. God was there and always had been. And so he says the word was with God. So John again makes that distinction between the word and God. So not only did the Logos exist at the same time as God, he existed distinct from God. So that word from there is the word pros. In the Greek, the preposition with implies communion. It's not just something that existed alongside, it's something that's working in concert, as if people are speaking face to face. If I'm communing with you like I am now, I am with you having this class. So the word was with God. The Logos is not subordinate to God. The Logos is of equal mind, purpose, and power. And that purpose and power is carried out in creation. And the word was God. So the Greek then reads theos in hologos, which means God is the word. Some translators have incorrectly rendered this phrase, the word was divine. Now, why is that different? Why would that be different from the word was God? Isn't God divinity? Well, yes, but it makes Jesus sound as if he is derivative of God, as if he stemmed from God or is subordinate to God. Okay, so this dramatically diminishes the meaning, making the Logos an agent whose nature is of God, divine, rather than God himself, deity. So I know that seems like splitting hairs, but that's a hair that's caused many a heresy. Okay, no pun intended.
And the difference between a description of quality and identity.
Yes.
There is a very big difference between them.
Right. Yes, that's true. Between quality and identity. I like that. Okay, so in particular, the Jehovah's Witnesses, let's take them for example. The Jehovah's Witnesses have rendered this with an indefinite article to read the word was a God, which again diminishes the Logos role. John's statement is direct. Theos in hologos. God was, and was continuing on into the future. God was the word. There's no doubt about it.
There's one other thought we might add. In Greek, usually the first word of a sentence is the point of emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
And this begins with God.
Right.
Even though it's translated in English, it's actually the last word in English.
Yes.
But it is the first word in Greek, and that's the point that John is emphasizing.
Right. Yes. So he puts it out there at the very beginning. That's correct. Okay. All things then, continuing on, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So John now addresses the Logos' active role in creation. Since Genesis explicitly states, in the beginning, God, the implication is that the Logos must be equally involved in this description. Especially since God speaks, as we just said, let us make. There's no inferiority. There's no single one part of creation that the Logos was not involved in. So again, this is a unified force, not an upper and a subordinate. In him was life. Okay, now we're exploring this a little further. In him was life. Just as the Logos was the origin of creation, he's also the extension, is also by extension the origin of life, both earthly and eternal, because he is life. Okay, so he is the will of God. He is the expression of the will of God. And life is in that expression. God wills life. And so it's by the word that God breathes into man's nostrils the breath of life, and man becomes a living creature in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. The view of the word as the source of life, then, plays a large part in the purpose of John's narrative. That's going to be part of John's statement there towards the end of the gospel, that believing in him, you may have life. Life is a huge key to what John is leading us towards. It doesn't matter if he tells us that Jesus is God if we're not getting the end point of it, because he's leading us to God for a purpose, and that purpose is eternal life.
Brother, I think that is what he uses Logos here, he uses it only a few times
Mhm.
in the beginning, and then he gets right to the light.
Yep.
This illuminates.
Yep.
This word illuminates, and you need that illumination to give life, or give life.
Mhm.
You need that. So he's getting really to who he is and what he's all about, life.
Right, right. Setting that from the very beginning. I mean, if the Bible starts with it, it's got to be important, right? So that's exactly what John is doing. Okay, now, what about that life? What about that light? That life was the light of men. And so then there's a close connection then between light and life. You know, we merely have to look at nature to see that life in the macro sense can't be sustained in the absence of light. Hence the reason why light is the first creation of God. Okay, so light allows us then, though, so, you know, you think about that in the biological sense. I mean, obviously we have photosynthesis and things like that. We need vitamin D, which comes, the best source is sunlight. But think about some of the other things that light does, all right? Light allows us to discern the form of things. If we were having this class in Mammoth Cave, I would not be able to discern your form. I can't see you. I can't see the odd. I don't even know if any of you would be there. I might just be speaking to nobody. But here in the light, I can see all of you and you can see me. And so there's distinguishing form. We can judge the distance between objects. It gives us spatial awareness. We can determine size, relation, all kinds of things by what we can see, because light bounces off of things, goes into our retinas and gives us clarity. Now, as Paul states in Ephesians 5, everything exposed by the light is made clear. And so then the word, being that light, reveals what was previously unseen or not understood. So we're going to have to make some assertions here then. If that word was life and was the light, then if we don't have that word, where are we? What's that going to leave us? In darkness. Yeah, exactly right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. And John is going to bring that point out. I think that's going to be a major point that John is going to bring out. The fact that we can see something. You know, you go back to the intro class from last week. One of John's major themes is seeing, believing life. So we don't see without light. Now I know that's, I don't know, we're kind of getting metaphorical there, but that's what John's doing for us. Okay, so light allows us to see, and Paul says everything exposed by the light is made clear. The word reveals what was previously unseen or not understood. And so in this case, the word, the light, came into the world to reveal the person and character of God to his creation. You ever thought, I think about how to ask this question. You ever spoken to somebody who doesn't really know anything about God? Or maybe they have a kind of a vague concept of God, but not really anything about it. Or maybe you've had those questions yourself. You think, I really need to know more, or I want to know more. I want to understand more. Especially, I've got people telling me that God made me. Well, if I'm going to understand why, I want to understand more about the one who chose to make me. I mean, that's the whole reason we got things like Ancestry.com, right? We want to know more about where we came from. Well, in this case, the light came into the world to reveal the Father. That's what he's going to say in John 1:18. And so that's what that light does for us. It not only brings us out of darkness, but it reveals an individual for us. All right, let's continue along. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, does anybody have the New American Standard? The light does not comprehend it. Okay, so we can read this then in two ways. Okay, we can say the light has, or the darkness has not overcome it, as in the darkness cannot defeat the light. And so you have an adversarial sense there. But also, if you read it that way, the light cannot comprehend it. Or I'm sorry, the darkness cannot comprehend the light. So before we get to that kind of subtle difference there, let's ask the question then, what is this darkness that John is talking about? All he calls it is the darkness. So what is that darkness? Well, darkness is pretty common language in the Old and New Testaments, most often as a metaphor for a lack of knowledge or understanding. And we know that is where sin thrives. So Job chapter 37, verse 19, Job says, teach us what we should say to him. We cannot prepare our case because of our darkness. We don't understand God, and so we have no basis upon which to question him. A fact that Job is going to be made very clear towards the end of that book, right? Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 18. So going back to Ephesians, where Paul uses that light and darkness theme pretty heavily. Paul writes, therefore I say this and testify in the Lord, you should no longer walk as the Gentiles walk in the futility of their thoughts. They are darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them and because of the hardness of their hearts. And so there you've got kind of both instances of that word then, right? You've got ignorance, a lack of knowledge, and you've got hardness of heart, which is an adversarial position against something. If I'm hardening my heart against you, I'm putting myself against you so that you can't affect my heart. So a lack of knowledge and an adversarial position. In the spiritual sense then, thinking about darkness that way, in the spiritual sense, light gives understanding, it provides discernment, and it allows us to overcome ignorance and error and judge righteously. We can judge righteously because then we have a greater understanding of what it is that we're seeing because the light makes it clear. Now, yes?
I think Colossians chapter 1 gives us some more understanding about this. Verse 12 through verse 13 reads, it's talking about Jesus. It says, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light, for he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. That's the power that Jesus has to give life.
And that's a theme that Paul will use in many of his letters, right? That coming out of darkness and coming into light. The context of Ephesians there is come out of darkness, bring yourself out of darkness into his light. Therefore, you can walk in the way of light. And then he'll expound on that. So yes, very good. So now look at the latter part of verse 5 then, regarding kind of the translation there. And I don't see these translations as mutually exclusive or differing in overall meaning. The Greek word for overcome or comprehend or apprehend means to seize tight hold of or arrest. So basically, the darkness cannot grasp the light. And again, that kind of goes back to what we talked about. If you're grasping something, it can be in an adversarial position as if to strangle it, or it can be, what do we say when somebody doesn't understand a concept? They're not getting a grasp of it. And so they're just not comprehending what it is. They're not picking up what I'm throwing down, is basically what it is. And so to master a given thing, we often say that one has to have a complete understanding or a grasp of that thing. The darkness, the ignorance, the sin will never fully comprehend the light, so it is by nature weaker. You've been enlightened. That's true. Yes. At last I've seen the light, right? All kinds of metaphors that we've used for that. But again, think about the relationship between those two. The darkness cannot overcome it. It is by nature weaker than the light. And so Jesus as the light then will always be stronger than the darkness. So the light can be rejected for a time, by one who chooses to cover it up. But in the end, the light will always conquer the dark. So going back to kind of that metaphor of Mammoth Cave, right? If you've ever been to Mammoth Cave, you know, they take you into the big room called the cathedral, and they kind of huddle everybody together. And then what do? They turn the lights out. And when the lights are out, you literally cannot see your fingers in front of your face. Okay? However, now I pull out this and I turn on that teeny tiny little light bulb in my phone. What does that do to the darkness? Well, it decreases it just a little bit. Everybody in the group takes out their phone, turns on that teeny tiny little light bulb. The darkness is diminished further and further. Now, as I'm standing there with that light on, and with that light, and everybody's in the presence of it, there's nothing that darkness can do to then come in and stifle that light. The light will always banish the darkness, but never the other way around. I hope that gives you a sense of hope. The light will always banish the darkness. And it will cause it to recede. And so then here then is the other function of the light, to expose what is hidden in the darkness. Darkness and light cannot coexist. What's the first thing that God did in creation? He separates the light from the darkness. Okay? The light was made in such a way that it excluded darkness. So Jesus is the light of men. He shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome him. It might seem to, but it cannot ultimately do it. With these in mind, then, let's pause for a second. We're going to move much faster now that we've kind of grasped those concepts. Let's pause for a second, kind of get a sense of how these 7 truths combine to form a composite image of Jesus as the Word. So first of all, Jesus was and is always has been eternal. Jesus is on equal standing with deity because he is deity. Jesus is the origin of all things. He gives life to all things. He gives direction and purpose to all things by revealing the Father. And Jesus' nature as the light then is exclusive of darkness. They cannot coexist. And so these truths are going to really keep coming to the forefront of John's narrative. Each truth presented here at the beginning of the book will show up in Jesus' words and his actions. Each miracle is a sign, is a little light, banishing that darkness further and further, pointing to the truth of his claim to be the Son of God and the Savior of man. Let me stop right there for just a second. Are there any further comments or questions on that concept? Pretty exhaustive.
I think one of John's major points that number 7 there is the darkness is keep trying to overcome Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Have his crucifixion, it looks like it did, but the ultimate is he was right.
Mm-hmm.
That's what John's saying.
It is. It is.
You mentioned at the beginning the philosophers and John's teaching is not derivative of theirs. I would argue it's actually the other way around. Their teaching is derivative of Moses,
Mm-hmm.
even though I could have first probably never even read or heard of Moses. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, all of these truths came from God, and then man has corrupted, derived them, turned them into their own feelings. But it still has that same root in the beginning, Genesis 1.
Romans chapter 1 and 2. What has been known about God has been made evident among them, so that even those living in ignorance have some concept. That's true. Yeah. That's very good. Okay, well, let's continue along then. All right, so now he directly kind of goes into this individual. Verse 6 through 9, there's a man named John who was sent from God. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So, having introduced this logos as the light, John moves closer to the historical setting by introducing the witness who was specifically tasked with preparing the way for the light to come. It's the person who literally came historically just before Jesus. So let's kind of note some things from the text about John's task here. The most important characteristic is that John is sent from God. John's arrival had been foretold in various places throughout the Old Testament as a precursor to the arrival of the Messiah. And I've got a few of those up there. We're not going to go and look at all of those. But this messenger, this herald, if you will, was someone that had been foretold would come, even up to the very tail end of the Old Testament. I'm going to send John the Baptist, or I'm going to send Elijah to you to proclaim the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Okay, so in the Old Testament, what do we call those people who were sent by God, specifically purposed, sent from God? We call them prophets. Okay, so John here is a prophet. Now, what's happened in the sense of kind of the big picture of the Bible? What has happened as far as God communicating with man just prior to John the Baptist coming? Got nothing, right? For 400 years, man has had no direct communication from God in the form of prophecy or dreams or any of those things. And then John the Baptist comes. So John the Baptist is specifically sent from God, or sent by God. Okay? And in speaking of that appointment, then, this John the Baptist, is later going to refer to the individual who set him to this task. He who sent me, and that's going to be the capital H, he who sent me. And so again, just like the Old Testament prophets who were directly spoken to and appointed by God, John has received a specific command. And what John the apostle writes about him is that his task was to testify about the light. Now, where do we most common use the word testify or witness? In a courtroom setting. Now, what's the witness, or what's the witness? What's the purpose of that? To verify the story, or to make the story clearer, right? So when we get in a courtroom setting, you got adversaries who are kind of at odds with each other. Their stories don't match up. We have witnesses to come in and start clearing things up. And they're all talking about that thing from their particular viewpoint. Well, John the Baptist's witness comes directly from the Father. And that word testify, you might have witness or bear witness or something like that. It is the word martyrio. And I think I mentioned this last time. It is the word from which we get the word martyr. What is a martyr? Well, a martyr is someone who believes something so intently that they proclaim that thing even to the point of death. So that's John's task, is to proclaim this with everything he's got. So his task is not just as simple as informing people about the light. Hey, let's go look at the Old Testament, talk about this thing. His job is to prepare people for the light and to call them to repent, make changes because of the light. This light is going to have direct implications for you and your behavior and your concept and your direct way of life. They're instructions for all who would seek the Lord. So this is not just for those that lived in John the Baptist's day. This is for all of us. Make ready the path of the Lord. John wants to make it very clear that John the Baptist, as charismatic as he is not the light. He's come to reveal the light, shed light on the light, right? Okay, let's move forward very quickly. I do want to try to get through this. So the reaction of the world to this message and to the light actually coming among it is ironically tragic. Jesus, as we've mentioned, is the creator. Jesus is the agent of creation. He is there with God at the very beginning. His creation, we can see around us, acts exactly as he meant it to. Wind blows, water flows, trees grow, animals frolic. All of those happen at the direction of God exactly as he meant them to do. Yet, there is one group that can choose to go against that direction, and it is us. It's us. We have free will. And so John's point here then is man exercised that free will in the wrong way. Many of them responded in the wrong way. They can respond to his word and will, but man who was created in his image did not know him. And the implication seems to be that it did not want to know him. It had no intention of knowing him. So the word recognize or know is going to be a very important word, and we'll leave with this point. The word recognize or know is there are two main words throughout the New Testament, especially throughout John, that mean to know. And there's a distinction between them. So the first is eidos, which means to see or experience or behold. I am here. I am experiencing you all sitting with me. I see you here. This is just a recognition of this is what it is. But then there is ginosko, which means I know each one of you, or most of you, sorry. I know most of you. I know where many of you live. I know many of your families. I know, in some cases, what you like to eat. I know you. And when my kids come in here, I know them better than any of you. It is this deep understanding. And so when John says the word Jesus came among his people and they did not know him, it's not that they didn't see him. They could see him walking among them. He was a man. He physically walked among them. But they did not know him. They did not come to know him. They didn't understand him. Okay, so this knowing, this understanding is a huge theme for John in his writings. And it's not necessarily in quantity in the gospel. However, it is peppered throughout the entire thing and is an emphasis of Jesus' teaching. It's the same word that John's going to use in his letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as evidence to his audience of the nature of true followers of Jesus. This is how we have come to know the Father. This is how we have come to know love, or be familiar with love. And yet, his own people did not receive him. Okay? Lest we think, though, that this I wanted to make this point, and I was thinking about this. So if you go back in the Septuagint, these two translations are present in two verses that are right next to each other. The woman saw, eidos, the woman saw the fruit. Once they ate of the fruit, though, verse 7, the eyes of both were opened and they knew, ginosko. They understood that they were naked. Now, what happens in the creation account and what Jesus is ultimately trying to overcome, what we can overcome through him, is we cannot let one overtake two. We cannot let what we directly see in front of us, let that motivate us. We have to come to this knowledge, this understanding. That motivates us. So, how is this relevant to us? Look in the news. What kind of news do you see? You got a war in Ukraine. You've got people in third world countries. You've got viruses and all these types of things. And you say, people might ask the question, why doesn't God do something? I see all of this stuff. I'm experiencing all of these things. But to ask that question, it's not a bad question. But to go nowhere with that question means that we never reach the second meaning of that word. We never reach an understanding of God. And that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so eidos and ginosko, right? So we're coming to a knowledge of God. And it says the world saw him but did not know him. We'll pick up here next time, and then I promise we'll move a lot faster. But thank you all for your comments this morning.